Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a story that's just full of huge hopes and, well, immense tragedy. We're talking about the rise of socialism, how it went from just an idea to a full-blown global empire.
So here's the big question we're going to try and unpack today. How on earth did a dream for a perfect world, a utopia, end up creating one of the most powerful and, frankly, most brutal empires of the 20th century? It's a huge question, and to even begin to answer it, we've got to go way back to the beginning.
All right, let's set the scene. We're in 19th century Europe. The whole continent is still trying to figure out what hit it after the French Revolution. You know, these huge political shockwaves. And right on top of that, a brand new force starts to completely reshape society, the Industrial Revolution. On one hand, you've got these new industries just booming, creating massive cities and incredible fortunes, seemingly overnight. But there's a dark side. For the vast majority of people, the ones actually powering this new age, it meant grueling work hours, terrible pay, the constant threat of unemployment, and just awful, grim living conditions.
So with all this turmoil, you can bet there was a huge battle of ideas. You had conservatives who wanted to keep things the way they were. You had liberals pushing for some changes, but only for men with property. Then you had radicals who were like, no, the government should be based on what everyone wants. But for a lot of people, all of these ideas felt, well, like they were just tinkering around the edges. They weren't getting to the real root of the problem, this massive economic inequality.
And right in the middle of all these debates, this other idea starts to emerge, one that was way more radical than anything else. We're talking about socialism. And socialists didn't just want to tweak the system, they wanted to tear it down and build something completely new.
Okay, so what's the core idea here? For socialists, it all boiled down to one thing: private property. They saw it as the root of all of society's problems. Their argument was pretty simple. As long as a few individuals own the factories and the land, they'll always put their own profit ahead of the workers' well-being. So what's the solution? The only solution, they said, was for society, everyone together, to take control of all that property.
And the guy who really gave this idea a powerful blueprint was, of course, Karl Marx. He looked at all of history and saw one continuous story, a struggle between different classes. He argued that in this new industrial age, the workers, what he called the proletariat, were basically destined to rise up and overthrow the whole capitalist system. And the endgame? To create what he called a communist society. This was supposed to be the final, ultimate form of socialism, where all property is shared, and the whole idea of class just disappears.
So fast forward to the early 20th century. You might think these ideas would take root in the most industrialized places, right? But no, they found incredibly fertile ground in one of Europe's least industrialized nations, the massive Russian Empire. This place was huge, ruled by an all-powerful Tsar, Nicholas II, and it was about to be pushed right to the edge.
And what pushed it over the edge? World War I. It was an absolute catastrophe for Russia. We're talking over 7 million casualties, crushing defeats on the battlefield, and back home, people were starving. The Tsar's government was totally discredited. You could feel the entire empire just crumbling under the weight of all this suffering.
And the speed at which it all happened is just staggering. Seriously, think about this for a second. In February, protest about bread shortages. Bread! Bring down a monarchy that had been around for 300 years. Just 2 months later, in April, the radical Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Lenin, is back in the country, pushing his own agenda. Then, after a chaotic summer, his party just seizes control of the whole country in October. An entire empire, gone and replaced in just 8 months. It's unbelievable.
So now they're in power, and the Bolsheviks do not waste a single second. They immediately kick off this massive, radical experiment to completely restructure Russian society. No waiting around, they were going to transform the country from the top down, and they were going to do it based on their socialist ideals.
And man, they move fast. It was breathtaking, really. They just started dismantling the old world piece by piece. All the banks and major industries, yep, now they belong to the state. All that land owned by the nobility, it's now social property, which was basically a green light for peasants to just go and seize it. The old world was being swept away, just like that.
But this is where the beautiful promises of the revolution just collide head-on with a really brutal reality. Lenin had promised peace, right? Well, that turned into a horrific civil war between the Bolshevik Reds and all their opponents. He promised land, that turned into violent, forced seizures. And he promised bread, but that gave way to mass starvation and famine as the whole country just tore itself apart.
You have to remember, for the peasants, and they were the vast majority of people in Russia, this was an incredible moment. For them, the revolution meant freedom. It meant finally getting the land their families had worked for generations. And it meant an end to the horrible war. It was a moment of real liberation. But of course, for the landowners, it was terrifying, a time of total uncertainty. And what's so fascinating is how different the experience could be from one place to the next. Some families faced violent mobs, their homes looted and burned, but others, like the family in this account, saw something almost polite, an orderly handover. It just goes to show this wasn't one single event. It was millions of different, complex human stories all happening at once.
Okay, so the revolution succeeds, the Bolsheviks win. But what kind of country did they actually build? This new Soviet experiment, well, it would go on to define so much of the 20th century, and it left behind a legacy that is, to this day, incredibly complex and fiercely debated.
Then comes Joseph Stalin. After Lenin dies, Stalin takes power, and he decides to force rapid industrialization and collectivize all of agriculture. And the human cost was just unimaginable. The country had grain shortages, so his solution was to force all the peasants onto these gigantic state-controlled farms. The result? Total chaos, massive resistance from the peasants, and it led directly to one of the most devastating famines in all of modern history.
And if you resisted, you were met with absolute, overwhelming force. Just look at these numbers from Ukraine, from just a 2-month period in 1930. Over 25,000 people arrested simply for not wanting to go along with it. Most were shipped off to labor camps or exiled. Hundreds were just straight up executed. This was the price tag for building this new world.
And this is where we get to the great, mind-bending paradox of the Soviet Union. Because while all of this horror was happening inside the country, the image it projected to the outside world was one of incredible progress. You had famous, influential people like the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore visiting and seeing what looked like a miracle. A poor, backward country was suddenly a great power, feeding its people, educating everyone. To many, it looked like a beacon of hope.
But that shining image stood in such stark contrast to the reality for millions on the inside. A letter like this one from a single peasant, it just shows you the slow, grinding reality, the destruction of individual lives, where the state could just come and take everything you had, your property, your home, all in the name of the greater good.
And that leaves us right back where we started, with that central, haunting question about the Soviet experiment. Was it an engine of progress or a machine of oppression? I mean, it turned a nation into a global superpower. It inspired people all over the world. But it did all that by crushing freedom and at the cost of millions and millions of lives. It's a massive contradiction, and it's one people are still fiercely debating today.